right, so we are really excited about the morning general session. The reality for most of us, right, as business owners, right, as business people, is that we spend the majority of our time with our heads down in our businesses. The idea that we can spot trend is, it's impossible, right? We're busy at the practice of making organizations better and better day by day. In fact, our exposure to technology largely comes from our consumer behavior, right? So we use Uber and Lyft, but we don't necessarily think about how the principles of an on-demand workforce could affect our businesses. We use Bixby, right? But we don't think about how direct-to-consumer subscription models might affect what we do on a day-by-day basis. Our heads are down building our businesses and stuck in the echo chamber of sort of our daily lives in that regard. And even if we can lift up our eyes, it's almost impossible to find the signal within the noise. There's so much noise about what's coming down the pipe from a technology, from an innovation standpoint, that it becomes almost impossible. For the emerging franchisors in the room, it's exacerbated, right? I mean, you guys are filling 4 or 5 roles within your organizations. You're generally capital light, right? Capital strapped. And so the idea that you're going to do anything in terms of, moving your business down the line 2 generations it's hard, right? You spend most of your time just figuring out your day-to-day. And so it's understandable, right? What we're excited about this morning is this is an opportunity for you to spend 45 minutes to an hour with somebody who, well, first of all, we're going to ask you to turn your phones off. Turn your phones off. Nothing's going to go wrong in your business for the next hour, okay? Put them down, put them in the middle of the table, do whatever you need to do to get rid of it. And focus your attention on the next hour. Because it could be the most pivotal hour, the most meaningful time that you spend here over the course of the 2 days. So give it its attention, because you're going to talk to somebody who's at the forefront of emerging technology in the franchise business. Dan Monaghan has been involved in emerging technologies since 1995. Okay, he started WSI in 1995. Prior to Google, prior to the launch of Google. That's how long he's been doing this. His companies have over 1,000 locations, okay, 1,000 franchisees. So he understands not only the implications of emerging technology, but also the implications at scale. So you literally have somebody for the next 45 minutes to an hour who can help you find that signal within the noise. And we're super, super excited for it. So Dan Monaghan.
Thanks, man. Thank you, John. Thanks, Lane. When Lane asked me to do this, I thought it's a really topical thing to discuss, because it's something that we're all kind of thinking about and probably talking about in our businesses in various ways. At Clear Summit Group, when we look at partnering with a new brand, one of the first things we think about is how will this brand be impacted by disruption? So we're going to talk about disruption today, if I figure out how to use this. And we'll talk about technology. We'll talk about how disruption happens, why, what we can do as franchisors to hedge against the impacts of disruption in our business. A lot of times when people talk about disruption and technology interchangeably. But the reality is that not all technology is disruptive. And not all disruption is driven by technology. Some disruption happens with business models, and we'll talk a little bit about that this morning, disruptive business models. Some technology is very incremental. When people talk about social and mobile, a lot of times they think about, they're talking about disruption. But some technology is just really incremental. It helps us serve our customers better. It helps us operate more efficiently as an organization. But it's not really disruptive. Some technology strikes at the very core of our business models, and it's exponential in its impact, and that's where disruption comes in. When we look around the world, there's countless examples of companies that were disrupted, former iconic brands that didn't manage change very well. But a lot of times people assume that disruption happens quickly, and that's not always the case. It was back in 1975 when Steve Sasson invented the digital camera. And it wasn't a very sexy product. It was about 7 pounds. It took images that were about 100 pixels by 100 pixels. So it's about 1/100th of a megapixel by today's standards. By the way, Steve Sasson worked for Kodak back in 1975 when he invented that device. And you can imagine the Kodak execs weren't super impressed by the technology because the images look like this, kind of grainy, and they certainly weren't afraid of the impact. But that's because they didn't consider the exponential impact of that resolution improving. What if that resolution improved if it doubled every year? Where would that be in 10 years? Where would it be in 20 years? So 25 years later, Kodak's still not really investing in this technology. In fact, in 2001, you got Kodak and Fuji that are both about the same size companies. If you look at their annual reports, it's about $14 billion, and both of them, Kodak is still milking the film cash cow, right? And yet Fuji starts investing in digital imaging. So through this whole cycle, Fuji fares very well, and of course Kodak, the ones who invented the digital camera, are bankrupt. So Blockbuster's another classic example, and people think Blockbuster was disrupted by technology, but it was actually a business model disruption that happened there. It's Reed Hastings loses his copy in the mid-90s, loses his copy of Apollo 13. And by the time he finds it and returns it to Blockbuster, he gets a $40 fine. And he's so ticked off about this as he's driving to the gym, he's starting to think about how does their business model work compared to the rental industry. They don't care how many times you come to the gym or if you come at all, as long as you keep paying that monthly subscription. And how could we blend that together with the video rental business? And that's how it all started. And it wasn't advanced technology unless you consider the U.S. Postal Service advanced technology, because they were just mailing, DVDs. It was later down the road that the video streaming came into play. But in the early days, Netflix was just an annoyance to Blockbuster. They made so much money, Blockbuster, on their late fees that they didn't even consider shifts in their business model. They could have bought Netflix for $50 million. And of course, today, we know where Blockbuster is, bankrupt, and Netflix is worth $161 billion. Right? So obviously, some big shift. And part of the challenge for us as business people is we have to be willing to disrupt ourselves. Sometimes we're so good at something and something so core to our business that we're unwilling to consider change. I grew up in a small city called Kitchener-Waterloo, and a pretty ordinary town, about 50,000 people. The one thing that was unique about Waterloo is the university we had. University of Waterloo is one of the top math and engineering universities in the world. Bill Gates would come every year personally to Waterloo to recruit engineers as he was building Microsoft in the early days. And in fact, when we brought our nanny over from China, after she was finished taking pictures of our sky, the blue sky, and sending them back home, because where she came from, it's mostly green, she wanted to get in a bus and go to University of Waterloo and take pictures and say, this is where I am, I've actually arrived. It's a famous university. And as a result of that, this town that I've come from has become kind of the Silicon Valley of Canada. And there was a company born there a number of years ago called Research in Motion. And some of you had a product of theirs called the BlackBerry, which was invented in 1999, and within less than a decade became the 16th most valuable brand on the planet, ahead of BMW, ahead of Walt Disney, all kinds of iconic brands. And in fact, the President of the United States said he couldn't live without that device. So we're talking about a product that goes to the pinnacle of success, right? And then in 2007, on a stage in San Francisco, Steve Jobs did something he said he'd never do. He launched a smartphone, the iPhone. And within 2 years, well, this wasn't 2 years, but a very short period of time, the BlackBerry was gone. It was dead. I know there's a few of you that have them in your pockets. And there is one, I think, in the Smithsonian. And I'm not supposed to say this, being from Waterloo, but for all intents and purposes, the BlackBerry is dead. So how did that happen? You know, a lot of people chalk it up to corporate hubris or infighting amongst founders, but the BlackBerry story is much deeper than that. You know, some people say, well, they lost touch with their customers. No. Exactly the opposite. These guys were obsessed about their customers. They knew exactly what their customers loved about their product. They loved the BBM. Does anyone remember that? Before WhatsApp, right? They loved the security of the product. But most of all, they loved the keyboard, right? And for those of you that remember other mobile devices at the time, you'd have to be like a squirrel, like typing on them to try to type anything out. But the BlackBerry invented this amazing parabolic keyboard where we could type with opposing thumbs at light speed. It was an amazing product. And so the thought of doing anything and leaving that keyboard behind was unthinkable. Their customers literally would have revolted had they done that. The other thing is, Mike Lazaridis was one of the smartest guys on the planet when it came to spectrum and frequency technology. He knew that what Steve Jobs was saying on that stage was not possible. He knew it wasn't true. And the truth is, he was right. Because in the years that followed, some of us remember the early years of the iPhone, calls were being dropped left, right, and center. There was the AntennaGate scandal. Lawsuits were flying because the product didn't deliver on what it said it would do. No serious business person back in the early couple of years of the iPhone would have actually used an iPhone, right? It was kind of like a toy, and that's the way it was viewed. But Steve Jobs played a chess move that nobody saw coming. He entered into a 5-year exclusive agreement with AT&T to allow AT&T to invest into the network in a way that nobody saw coming, so that within a couple of years, the iPhone promise actually materialized. And by that time, it was too late for a lot of other companies, and BlackBerry was actually anchored to that keyboard. There's a lot of things that held them back from progressing, but one of the things was the thing that was so great about their product, anchored them to the past. And so the question for us as business leaders is, what is our keyboard? What are the elements of our business model that we're so committed to, or the things that we know so well in our business that are actually anchoring us to the past and maybe holding us back from the future? Let's talk about some of the disruptions that are going on right now around us. The gig economy, as The Economist magazine calls it, is starting to create ripples, right? And probably a lot of us are thinking about that. The gig economy, the fact that people are going around businesses and dealing directly with service providers, as an example. A lot of people, when they think about Uber, they think about this as technology disrupting the marketplace. No, it's not. Uber is pretty basic technology. This is just two mobile devices speaking to each other. What's disruptive about Uber is the business model change, where they've cut out the taxi companies. The fact that we can now just connect directly through Uber with the drivers, that's what's disruptive. And so as business people, we need to think about our businesses. Are they commoditizable? You know, would someone prefer to go around you, go directly to your service provider? Would they sooner deal directly with your painter, your tutor, your caregiver, your dog walker, your maids? Now, what's going to happen as that begins to expand? It actually brings into question what's the value of a brand, right? A brand has always been, you know, there's a promise that came along with that. There was a company to stand behind it, right? But now we start to question what's the value of a brand. I mean, if I can go online, go onto Amazon, and I can find the best painter in my area and connect with that guy directly, and Amazon is going to stand behind that and guarantee the services with Amazon Home Services, where does that lead, right? Google's getting into the game as well, because what research has shown in Inc. magazine, they said 88% of customers they trust online reviews as much as they trust what a family or friend says about a product. So where does this lead? Well, I can tell you in the short term, a lot of companies are saying, hey, this is kind of cool. Now I can buy leads directly from Google, and they're looking at it as a bit of a lead generation play. But where does that go in the bigger picture, longer term? Now, sometimes people will say, well, our customer service is what's really distinctive about us. That stands between us and the competition. Nobody's going to want to deal with an independent, right? Our customer experience, really? We need to think about that, and it may be true, but let's just think about that. If you had a taxi company and you had the best customer service in your dispatch department, how much of a hedge would that be against Uber? You see, we have to begin by asking, what does the customer really want? They don't want great customer service in the dispatch department. They want a ride right now, right? It's irrelevant how good the customer service of the dispatch department is. How many people have ever ordered an Amazon product? Could I get a show of hands? Okay, now here's my question, and I don't know the answer to this, but how many people have ever spoken to the Amazon customer service department? Could I get a show of hands? Okay, not too many. Okay, a lot of people don't even realize they have a customer service department to answer the phone. But what's interesting is Amazon is rated the number 4 company across the entire economy of any brand, number 4 in customer service. Company that most of us don't even realize they have a customer service department, right? Because we don't want Amazon customer service. Amazon knows the 3 things that we want is selection, speed of delivery, and price. And everything in their strategy leans into that virtuous circle of those 3 elements. So, in fact, that's a higher rating than Lexus, than Costco, than Toyota, and many other super customer service brands. So how do we defend against that? How do we defend against the commoditization that comes with the gig economy? I think a good example of that is a Canadian brand that some of you might be familiar with, a company, One Day Wow Home Painting. And I've got CertaPro painting my house right now. They're doing an amazing job, by the way. And I was talking to the guy, the franchisee, and super successful guy. And I said, tell me about One Day Wow. How does that work? And he said, well, One Day Wow is going to paint your house in one day, regardless of how big the job is. They just kind of burst the job based on the size. So if you've got, if the job is like twice as big, twice as many painters show up that day. Now, when I think about that, I can't get that through Amazon Home Services because they've bundled the offering or bundled the business model in a different way. I can't go onto Google and find anyone else that can paint my house in one day. Now, I didn't want my house painted in one day in particular, but the point is, it's a different way of bundling a business model. So think about our businesses. So for example, Tutor Doctor, one of our brands. We've actually taught customers how to buy in some ways, right? Same with our home care brand. People call up and they ask how much per hour? How much is your tutor per hour? How much is your caregiver per hour? Well, the reality is, in the tutoring business, they don't want to buy blocks of hours. What they want is outcomes, right? They want their son or daughter's grade to go from a B to an A, or from an A to an A+. So how can we better explain our offering so that we're not just selling hours? So at Tutor Doctor, we're really leaning into something we call X Skills. It's a program that teaches kids how to learn, to accelerate their learning, executive functioning skills, helping kids who are smart but scattered become better students. Now, how do you break that down into a per-hour offering, right? So thinking about how we unbundle stuff so it's not quite as commoditizable. So let's talk about another disruptor. Let's talk about automation. I was recently in New York at a private equity event, and sitting on the panel was a big private equity company, and they said, we will not consider investing in any QSR brand in the restaurant space that isn't currently experimenting with automation. Now, whether that's automation in creating the product, making the food, whether that's automation in taking the orders, but automation is going to hit across many industries. And we're starting to see it in different areas. The other day I arrived at an airport, and when I looked to my right, this is what I saw. A real long line of people waiting to get to the budget counter. Fortunately, I hadn't rented with budget, and I looked to my left, and this is what I saw. Okay, no lines, and now I've never used one of these things before, so I'm thinking, okay, how's this going to work? Well, within 10 minutes, I was in my car. And that's what I wanted. I didn't want great customer service from the car rental desk. I wanted a car. And the interesting thing that occurred to me as I was going through this process, they did an incredible job of exactly what you would want the customer service person to do. They upsold me on the insurance. They upsold me on the GPS unit. They upsold me on whether I wanted to come back with the tank full or, all those upsells nothing was missed. It was perfect. It was seamless. And so how is automation going to change our businesses and actually improve the customer experience? Let's talk about artificial intelligence, AI and machine learning. A lot of talk about AI these days. What is it? You'll remember the buzzword over the last number of years was big data. Why do we start talking about big data? Because today we are generating massive quantities of data in everything we do. Our computers, our cameras, our phones, our vehicles are spinning off. These are data machines spinning off data into the cloud, some of the new cars. Our social media activity, we are creating massive amounts of data. In fact, today, in one day, as humankind, we create more data than all of humankind created since the dawn of civilization through to 2003. We create that much data in one day. Right? So what machine learning is the ability to apply computing power to that massive mountain of data to be able to find patterns and discoveries and observations. So, to give you an example, let's just look at one example, and it's happening in every industry, but let's look at in medicine. If we could feed in x-rays, millions of x-rays into a computer, and also feed in those diagnoses or the observations that the radiologist made, the computer can look at the image, look at the observation, look at the image, look at the diagnosis. After we have millions of these, the computer starts to say, if this, then that. If this, then that. And it builds an algorithm where it can actually do that. Well, today, through artificial intelligence, we're more efficient, computers are more efficient at analyzing radiology scans than humans. A job that didn't exist a couple of decades ago will cease to exist in the next number of years, right? And that's just one of many areas, but that's how computing power we need. So wherever we have massive quantities of data, AI is a very powerful application. So let's just look at our social, what we're doing socially, okay? Social data. Let's look at Facebook. What we see or what we think Facebook knows about us is like an iceberg. What we think they know about us is the stuff that's on top of the water. What they really know about us is all that stuff below. It's all the stuff we don't even think about when we're looking at our feed. Did you look at this video? How long did you look at it? Who did you like? And so they're building this massive amounts of data. That's why this company, even after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, is still worth almost $500 billion because of their data. So how will that be used? There's this whole field emerging called algorithmic criminology, where they found that we can, by looking at what's going on in our social activity, we can actually predict who will commit crimes, where, and when. Police forces are beginning to use this technology. It's like that movie, remember Minority Report? Okay, that's directionally where things are moving. For example, credit reporting. It's now been shown that who we're connected to online, with Facebook as an example, is a better predictor of whether we'll pay our bills than our credit score. How will that be used in the future? How will that disrupt various industries? So the point is that when we have vast quantities of data, when we apply computing power to that, we see patterns and discoveries that we could have never as human beings seen before. It's beyond finding a needle in a haystack. It's like finding a needle in an ocean of data. And that's what we can do with AI. So how is this applicable to us here in the room as franchisors? Well, first of all, depending on what agency you're using, you may already be using AI in some of your lead generation stuff. Google has made its AI available for things like PPC and lead gen. So in other words, it's like you're saying to Google, I want more leads that look like this, right? And then Google looks at all of its data and basically is able to profile who it wants to show the ads to bring in more people just like that, right? And of course, Facebook does similar kinds of things as well. But imagine as we take this a little bit further down the line, imagine if we could say, I want more franchisees like this, right? Take a look at your top 10% of your franchisees. And of course, we've done a lot of things over the years, right? Psychometric profiling, personality profiling, et cetera. But what if we could use big data and we say we want more franchisees like this? So that when leads came into our system, we could know that there was an 87% probability that this particular lead will become one of our highest performing franchisees. How would you treat that lead differently in the process, right? Some of you may use HubSpot. Why did HubSpot buy Chemvi, a machine learning company? Because that's exactly what HubSpot plans on doing with their technology. And many others are investing in the same kinds of ways. I can tell you, for those CEOs in the room, the biggest impediment to effectively leveraging AI in the future for you will be how clean is your data. As you start looking at leveraging AI, you realize that many companies, your data is kind of messed up. Some of our data was messed up as we started to look at it. So setting up the proper data structure, I was talking to a CIO of a billion-dollar franchise company that most of us know, and he said, we're pretty agnostic when it comes to the application level or the application layer of our business. Our CRM, our digital marketing system, we'll commit to that for 3 or 4 years. But the one thing that we are not agnostic about is our data layer. All the data from those systems flows into our data warehouse, and that is ours, and we control that, and we'll build the future of the company on that. So that's the way we need to be thinking about, is how do we make sure that our data is clean so we can leverage AI as time goes on. A lot of companies will say, well, yeah, but machine learning and stuff, we're just an emerging brand. We're not like the big companies to do that kind of stuff. Reality is there's democratization of machine learning going on right now. You remember the days when if you wanted to have email in your company, you needed an email server in the server room, right? Now, if you're a 3-person company and you've got Google Apps, Gmail, you got a far better email system than that server room ever had, right? The same is happening in machine learning. Amazon has their system, Google has TensorFlow, IBM has Watson, Microsoft has a cloud as well. So basically, you can plug into these things on a very small scale on a pay-as-you-use basis. So it's really only limited by your imagination. What is it you want to ask the data? What answers would you like to come out of that data? And I can tell you, I expect emerging brands will far more effectively use this going forward than some of the big brands, just because they're more agile and they're just thinking in a more bootstrap kind of way. What about bots? Whether that's a bot on a website, which is like a chat bot type of thing, whether that's the bots in our pocket, right? Like Siri and Alexa. Now, if you listen to Dharmesh Shah, one of the co-founders of HubSpot, he says that in the future, bots will replace websites. Meaning, why do we go to a website? We go to a website because we want to get information. But what if the bot could just anticipate our question? What if the bot could just feed us the answers, to our questions? We wouldn't even have to go to a website any more than we today go to encyclopedias. It's an old school way, right? In the future, we won't even be going to websites. So here's what's kind of cool, is that we can integrate our systems with these bots. So for example, at Tutor Doctor, we're integrated with Alexa. So you could say, hey Alexa, ask Tutor Doctor for my session report. And Alexa will read the feedback from that tutor through any Alexa-enabled device. You can ask Alexa, if you're a franchisee, you could say, hey Alexa, ask the Big Apple for my KPIs. So if you're a franchisee, the Big Apple is our ERP or CRM system. It will now feed you the KPIs through Alexa. Now, how do we do that? Well, for those of you that remember, there was a gold rush kind of around domain names years and years ago, right? If you were Starbucks, you wanted to make sure you owned starbucks.com. Well, now Alexa or Amazon is allowing you to lock up what they call skills or invocations, voice invocations. So think about how might your brand interact with bots in the future? How might it interact with voice-activated devices? You now have an opportunity with Amazon to lock those things up for your brand, okay? So let's talk about another disruptor, blockchain. This is one of the things that people probably least understand of all the things we'll talk about. What is blockchain? A lot of times people think blockchain and they automatically think Bitcoin. Well, Bitcoin is just one of over 1,500 cryptocurrencies in blockchain. And blockchain, cryptocurrencies is only one of many ways to use the blockchain. So let me try to explain what blockchain is. Today, when we interact in the digital world or even in the offline world, we go through a platform, a company, an intermediary, but we're going through somebody in the middle, right? So if I want to pay my bills, if I want to transact money, I have to go through a bank, right? The bank is that intermediary. If I want to buy travel, I go through a travel agency, I'll go through maybe Expedia, or I'll go through Airbnb, but I'm going through somebody in the middle. If I want to get a car, or I want a ride, I go through Uber. I'm going through somebody who connects both sides of that marketplace. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, that intermediary, that platform, is trusted by both sides of the equation. Secondly, that intermediary usually controls the database. So the bank has the database that controls all of our transactions. Uber knows about all of our rides and makes sure everything's kept in one place. And the third reason is because that intermediary enables us to transact. Right? We need to be able to send, whether that's payment through Visa or money, but we need to be able to transact. And Uber makes sure that the driver's paid, and Uber makes sure that I'm charged and that everything lands correctly. Well, in the future with blockchain, we blow up the platform. There is no platform anymore. And the reason we do that is because all of those things reside in the blockchain. So as it relates to trust, everything is completely incorruptible. It's completely transparent. Everybody can see everything that's gone on. There's nowhere to hide. There's no way to kind of rip off the system when it comes to the trust piece of it. When it comes to the database, there is no central database. The database is across the blockchain. So everybody has part of that database as part of the blockchain. So there is no central database anymore. And thirdly, as far as ability to transact, that's what cryptocurrency's for. So we're not going to need money anymore. Well, we'll have money. It's still a currency, but we're easily able to pay through blockchain. So in the future, I wouldn't want to be a bank. I wouldn't want to be Visa or MasterCard. In fact, I wouldn't want to be Uber, because we don't need Uber anymore, right? We don't need Uber taking their 25% out of the system, because with blockchain, we'll connect the rider and the driver directly, right? So any kind of centralized platform is going to be blown up in the future. This will be massively disruptive across the economy, right? Not so much socially, but definitely in terms of economic terms. Let's talk about franchising. How does this land here in our world? Well, supply chain is a huge thing, right? Especially in the restaurant business and things like that. There's many movements as a product moves from the farm to the table, right? What blockchain does is it tracks every one of those elements. So as a product moves from point A to point B, how long did it take? What was the temperature every step along the way? If the truck stopped, where did it stop? For how long? All of that is completely tracked in real time. No manual, no lack of transparency, it's all there. That's why Starbucks is now beginning to track beans from the field through to the cup. Walmart is beginning to use blockchain in its logistics. So it's very powerful and will have a big impact in franchising as far as supply chain. What about smart contracts? This is another important feature of blockchain. So today, when we create legal agreements, we're creating an agreement between what are the obligations that both parties are willing to commit to, and it's documented in that document. Imagine that document coming to life and actually participating in every stage of the transaction. Okay, that's what a smart contract is. It's actually tracking who's doing what through the process, tracking that the proper payments are being made along the way. When we do legal agreements, today we have the ability to opt out of litigation, right? We can choose arbitration as a dispute mechanism in our agreement. Well, in the future, we're going to be able to opt out of both of those, right? Because we'll be able to arbitrate any disputes through the blockchain. All the participants in the blockchain will be able to help moderate what the outcome is, because every part of it is completely transparent. It's much easier to say who did what and who didn't do what. So that's where that'll have huge impact. I don't know if it'll affect franchise agreements, but the point is it'll affect many agreements throughout the economy. I think one of the most socially disruptive things we're going to experience in the years to come is virtual reality. It probably will have a bigger impact than the World Wide Web did. Now, explaining transformational technologies is always difficult. I remember in the early days of WSI, We used to buy round-the-world tickets with British Airways. They had a ticket at the time. You could go around the world and stop as many times as you wanted, as long as you kept going east. And so we would do, seminars to business people trying to explain this thing called the internet and how it was going to change the world. And by the way, we had to go out into the field because nobody was on the internet. This was before anybody was really there. And one of the ways I would explain it is I would say, how many of you had a fax number on your business card 10 years ago? And there'd be almost no hands. Okay, this is back in 1995, 6, 7. Then I'd say, how many of you have a fax number on your business card today? And most of the hands would go up. And then I'd say, in 5 years from now, we'll all have an email address on our business card. And I'd get these blank stares. Like people just, like deer in the headlights, they just didn't understand. If I told you 10 years ago that in the future, we'd be all carrying around hypnosis devices, would you believe it? I mean, remember television, they'd have the hypnotist was swinging the watch in front. If I said we'd all be carrying around hypnosis devices, would that be believable? If I said families would sit together at dinner time, spending quality time together as a family, staring into their hypnosis device. The other day I was at a Starbucks, a mother and daughter spending some quality time together, both sitting there staring into their hypnosis device. Walking through the airport, 5 security workers sitting on a bench, not talking to each other, just staring into their hypnosis device. And of course, we all know what I'm talking about, right? It's our smartphones. But the point is, it has had such a sociological impact in terms of changing how we interact with humans. Kids are at a party today with all kinds of people, but they're really alone as they're looking into that device. It's changed society in a very significant way because it's so compelling and in many ways addictive. Now imagine if we could actually enter that world, if we could actually go into that world, not just interact through this interface, but if we could go into that world. How many people have seen Ready Player One? Could I get a show of hands? Highly recommended, just to understand how society is going to change. I was on a conference call a few weeks ago with the head of HTC in China, and this guy was very involved with Steven Spielberg in creating this movie. And it was critical to Spielberg that everything in that movie was either possible today or was conceivably possible in the next number of years. He wanted this movie to be prophetic. He wanted people to be able to look back and say, in 2018, Spielberg actually predicted this, and this is what's become of it. So the real question for us is, how will this change our customer interactions? How will it change our social behavior? Who will own the virtual world? Who will own the buildings in the virtual world? Who will control the advertising in the virtual world? When I walk down Times Square and I see those buildings, one building alone, $25 million a year in advertising. Who's going to control those properties in the virtual world? It's going to be very interesting. But in the more near term, and we'll probably begin using virtual reality for training of our staff in the franchise world, a very powerful tool to be able to accelerate learning. Augmented reality is somewhat different in that, and probably most of us remember Pokemon Go taking the world by storm. That's where we take a look at the real world, but something's layered over top of it, right? That's augmented reality. So an example of this, within the next few years, we're all going to have smart glasses, or we're going to have smart contact lenses, where we look at the world, but then there's a layer over top of it. So we can be looking at a storefront and see all the reviews layered on top of that storefront. We're walking down an aisle at a retail store, we'll see pricing and reviews on products. Okay? We'll be sitting on a streetcar and we can look across the aisle at a person. We'll be instantly able to pull up their LinkedIn profile, pull up their Facebook profile. We're going to be able to see all kinds of things about them. A little bit spooky, right? But that's the world we're moving into, especially with facial recognition. That technology already is here. Okay? So anyhow, some neat stuff happening. So from our perspective as franchisors, the question is, how do we hedge against disruption? How do we capitalize on the opportunities that these disruptive technologies bring? In many cases, when a franchisee joins a franchise system, they're getting a competitive advantage. They're in a better position to compete than a local business. But in some cases, that's not actually the case. Some franchise systems are very slow, very inflexible, very slow to evolve. Sometimes there can be this mantra. It was amazing what Sid said the other day, talking about the hierarchy of needs, right? Our interests are really aligned. We all want to be successful. But it's very easy at home office to say that franchisee, he's just not following the system. Do we ever hear that? Right? And so to what extent is the system maybe not following the marketplace? How do we separate the Steve Sassons and the Reed Hastings within our system, the innovators who may have the ideas that lay the foundation for the next generation of our business model? How do we separate those guys from that renegade franchisee who just won't follow the system? Because some of them look a little bit similar sometimes. Their characteristics are a little bit similar. I think the answer to this is how we leverage and capitalize on the intellectual capital of our franchisees. I think, when I think about McDonald's, the Quarter Pounder, the Big Mac, the Filet of Fish, Ronald McDonald, the Happy Meal, the Egg McMuffin, breakfast at McDonald's, these were all franchisee ideas. Most of our best ideas will come from our franchisees. The question is, how are we listening? And are we listening? There's a guy named Peter Senge who wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. And in that book, he says, the only sustainable competitive advantage we have in today's economy is the speed at which we learn as an organization. And so how are we building learning organizations? At Clear Summit Group, one of our principles is something we call Think Like Sherlock, where we encourage all of our home office team to be observing what's going on in the field through a lens of curiosity. That franchisee in Orange County who's just spiking in his same-store sales, what's going on there? Is there something we can learn? We've got 2 franchisees in Calgary. One's fairly flat, inner growth. The other one's up 40% year on year. The flat growth franchisee says she can't recruit enough tutors to meet the market demand. How is somebody else in the same market up 40% year on year? Is there something we might be able to learn about tutor recruitment? So creating that culture of curiosity in the organization. Of course, franchise advisory councils are a beautiful place where this all begins, are a wealth of information for all of us. We go one step further than that. We have what we call thought leadership committees, where we look at every lever within our business, every problem we need to solve or every lever. And we assign a committee that is franchisees that are passionate about the topic and have some subject matter expertise. So for example, as an example with Tutor Doctor, we have a thought leadership committee for tutor recruitment, another one for tutor engagement, another one for lead generation. We've got a technology committee. We've got a process improvement team. We call it the PIT. But these are all individual subcommittees that are all feeding knowledge into the organization. We use collaboration platforms. So there's a few examples of technology. There's Idea Scale, Idea Informer, User Voice. But here's an example of what it looks like. It's just a portal where franchisees can contribute their ideas. They can comment and talk about each other's ideas. They can plus the ideas and move them up, voting them up. They can vote them down. But as a result of this platform, information just feeds into the Franchise Advisory Council. It feeds into those thought leadership committees. We're a bit paranoid about how do we ensure that we don't lose a great idea that just because we didn't listen or just because it didn't percolate up. Those are some examples. Just in closing, I wanted to, there's a guy named Scott Galloway who wrote a book called The Four, and it's about how Apple and Amazon and Facebook and Google established these dominant positions in the marketplace. Apple, the first $1 trillion company, right? And Amazon is like, just a few billion behind, right? They're going to crack a trillion shortly. How did these companies establish these disproportionately powerful positions in the marketplace? We're moving towards a world of winner take all, where there's disproportionate rewards for those that are remarkable. And he said, there's never been a better time in history to be remarkable. But he also says in that book that there's never been a worse time in history to be ordinary. And I think the opportunity for us as franchisors, the opportunity lies within our franchisees. Those insights, those innovations that will help us hedge against disruption and develop that next iteration of our business model lies within our franchisees. And so the question is, can we humbly listen and learn from those we serve. So I hope that was helpful today, and I'm going to be around to talk about any of this afterwards if you like. Thanks.